In this segment, we're going to look a little bit more in detail at the geology of Oak Creek Canyon. So we're at a place called Encinoso Picnic Area. It's a third of the way up the canyon thereabouts. And as you go up the canyon, you start noticing things that are a little puzzling. In the cliff behind me, you can see that there's the basalts on top with nice columnar joints. But the basalts look like they're sitting on the very bottom of the Coconino, and then you're into the Supai. And so in this part of the canyon, you're missing all of the upper thickness of the Coconino. You're missing the Kaibab, which is on top of that. And so there's something going on in here such that you're missing a lot of section below the basalts in here. Turns out there's a structure going up Oak Creek Canyon called the Oak Creek Fault. And on the east side of the fault, that's the relationship you see. You see the basalts sitting on Coconino or locally sitting on Supai. No Kaibab, no upper Coconino present, just the lowest little bit of the Coconino. On the west side of the fault, the relationship is you see the basalts, but the basalts are resting on the Kaibab, which is the highest Paleozoic unit, which then rests on a full thickness of Coconino, which then rests on the Supai. So a complete section on the west side of the fault below the basalts, but missing a bunch of the upper part of the Paleozoic section on the east side of the fault. And so right now, because that's what we can see here, we're clearly on the east side of the fault. We're at a picnic area called Halfway. It's surprisingly halfway up Oak Creek. What Halfway has is a very curious relationship along the Oak Creek Fault. All of this country, the Mogollon Rim, the Mogollon Escarpment, all of these red rocks of Oak Creek, they're all basically part of the Colorado Plateau, and so they're nearly all flat lying. But if you look at the rocks behind me, those are definitely not flat lying rocks. And you say, well, okay, we're close to the Oak Creek Fault. The Oak Creek Fault is only 50 meters in that direction there. Here's a sketch that tries to illustrate the relationships along the Oak Creek Fault. On the west side of the fault, you have the whole upper Paleozoic section. You have the Supai, you have the Coconino, and you have the Kaibab, all Permian units, this part of it. And then there's basalt sitting on top. On the east side of the fault, you only have the Supai and the basal part of the Coconino. You're missing the upper Coconino and you're missing the Kaibab below the basalts. But the basalts are lower on this side, so you would say this side of the fault clearly has moved down. The east side is down dropped. And in that kind of a scenario, if this side's moving down, you would expect these rocks to be dragged down this way as this block moved past it. But the rocks behind me dipped the wrong way for that model. And so an interpretation that makes a lot of sense in here is you originally had this side up. As you uplifted the east side, you formed an east to west facing monocline, and then you eroded the Paleozoic rocks that had been uplifted on the east side of the fault. You then put the basalts across the whole thing and then down dropped the east side later. And so in this model, the Oak Creek Fault has two episodes of motion. It has an earlier east side up associated with a monocline. All the monoclines on the Colorado Plateau are Laramide in age. They're late Cretaceous, early Tertiary. And so you have an early Laramide monocline in here, and then that got reactivated, the fault did, and down dropped the side that had previously been uplifted. And that's how you explain the fact that the upper Paleozoic rocks are missing off the east side. That side had gotten uplifted, and you stripped those rocks off the top, and then later on you reactivated the fault. Many of the faults in the Colorado Plateau that started life as monoclines get reactivated by later motion. We're here at the head of Oak Creek Canyon, where the highway goes through a series of switchbacks and climbs out of the canyon. Behind me, you see some incredibly crushed whitish rocks. That's Coconino sandstone that's been crushed along the fault. The interesting thing here is if you look up at the basalts that are sitting on top of the Coconino, they're barely faulted, barely fractured. So that is consistent with the fact there was an early episode of faulting that predated the basalts. So if you look up above where we are, you can see a layer of basalt, and it's fractured a little bit, but nothing like the Coconino. This is consistent with an early episode of faulting associated with the early monoclinal fold that shattered the Coconino, and then the basalts came over the top after all that shattering had happened, and then the basalts got dropped down later. On the west side of the fault, these rocks are dipping off to the west. Presumably they're part of the early monocline that was formed when the east side of the block was uplifted. We're now at the very top of Oak Creek Canyon at the overlook that looks to the south over the canyon. And from here you can see the overall setting of the canyon. There's the low side, the east side, and the high side is the west side. There's basalt up on top there, and there's basalt down at this level. So that's the easiest interpretation, is that this fault's latest movement displaced the basalts down from here to here. The basalts are as young as about 8 million years in here, so the displacement on this fault has to be younger than that. The Oak Creek Fault continues north, and the heavily fractured nature of it, cutting through the Coconino sandstone, makes a really good aquifer that the city of Flagstaff uses for some of their groundwater. It's winter and we're looking south, so everything's a bit backlit, but on the west side of the fault you can see there's a pretty good thickness of Paleozoic rocks exposed below the basalts. On this side, they're mostly in the trees. There's a bit more Coconino than farther down canyon, but still not the complete Coconino section, and you're missing the Kaibab, the top unit. So even up here, you had this situation where you had to uplift this side of the fault, erode off the Kaibab, put the basalts over the top, and then down drop this side to make the basalts lower. This display at the top of Oak Creek Canyon at the overlook nicely characterizes the setting of the canyon. There's the low east side and the high west side. On the west side you have the upper Paleozoic section, Kaibab. Here they break out the Torweep separately. Structural geologists like me typically lump those two together unless we're mapping in the Grand Canyon. And then there's Coconino, and then here they've used the Snebly Hill Hermit nomenclature, Snebly Hill, Hermit, Supai. Traditionally, these have all been called Supai. This would be Supai A, this would be Supai B, and this would be Supai C. And so it also shows the Oak Creek Fault, and it shows the movement. And I'm sure for a sign like this, it was too complicated to show the earlier history with this side being up, and then you wrote everything off the top. But it nicely shows kind of what the setting of the canyon is right now. The Coconino sandstone, it was deposited by the wind, and it has beautiful large-scale crossbeds. They're inclined off to the southeast, showing you that the wind was blowing in that direction 250-something million years ago when the Coconino was deposited.